As you probably know by now, and as I've mentioned in a previous video, Donald Trump won the Republican primary in New Hampshire, as expected. But though MAGA is twisting itself in knots to pat itself on the back, as best demonstrated by a seemingly wasted Marjorie Taylor Greene, there are serious vulnerabilities which riddle Trump's victory. Vulnerabilities which may very well doom him in the general election, and hopefully will. Vulnerabilities which were publicly emphasized by the likes of Republican New Hampshire Governor Christen Nuno and liberal Fox News commentator Jessica Tarlov. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert buttons before you go. I'd greatly appreciate it. All right, friends, we got several clips to look at. Again, the top lines you're probably familiar with, but if not, I'll remind you. Donald Trump won the Republican primary in New Hampshire, as expected. Though he promised a 30-point margin of victory, he won it relatively narrowly. It was 54.4 to 43.3 against Nikki Haley, the last competitor against him in the primary. Now, again, Donald Trump, when he gave his victory speech, and I mentioned this in a previous video, he was furious. He was visibly agitated because Nikki Haley did not drop out. Nikki Haley has not ended her candidacy. She's going on, at least, she said, to South Carolina, which is the next major threshold in the Republican primary. So Donald Trump didn't seem confident or anything during his speech, and we're not going to play it. Just know that he was furious and insulting. But we do have Marjorie Taylor Greene as a bit of a surrogate here, and she was happy and seemingly drunk. And I'm going to play a couple of clips of her. This is what she had to say about the relatively thin margin between Trump and Haley.
These are fake numbers. Nikki Haley does not have this much support. She's going to come out and claim that she's rising in the polls. All these fake news media people up here on this platform are going to claim that Nikki Haley is rising in the polls. It's a total, complete lie. Absolute lie. Tonight, Nikki Haley was defeated. The problem is she's going to be dumb enough and she's going to be a fake candidate and she's going to keep going and we are going to destroy her in South Carolina. It's going to be a complete humiliation. I can't wait to see it happen.
So a couple of things. Note the glances between the two men in between which she's standing. They're clearly like, what is going on here? She seems to be drunk. She seems to be wasted. She just was funny. She said, it's an absolute lie. Absolute lie indeed. It was a lie from absolute vodka being presumably what she drank here. But yeah, just so much, baselessness. It was a fact-free diatribe. She can't even help herself. She's like, it's just fake. All this is fake. She's a fake candidate. And these are fake numbers. Everything is fake. Everything I like is fake. Pathetic. But it wasn't just the Republican primary. There was also an unsanctioned Democratic primary in New Hampshire as well. And President Biden did not campaign in New Hampshire. He didn't spend any money in New Hampshire, but Democrats were able to vote and they did a write-in campaign. And even though, President Biden was up against Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson, President Biden won the write-in campaign by 54.8%, against Dean Phillips. Dean Phillips is not handling it very well. He's regurgitating Laverne Spicer memes in suggesting that, more red states or the majority of the country is red and that it's liberal coastal elites that aren't paying attention. Just absolute nonsense. I wouldn't be surprised if he goes the Tulsi Gabbard route, but that's neither here nor there. Now, in response to President Biden winning the write-in campaign, this is what Marjorie Taylor Greene had to say, or rather the vodka that she drank through her mouth.
Right now.
So we can officially say the Biden-Harris campaign has dementia just like the president. They forgot to put him on the ballot and their voters are having to write it in. And he's losing. Joe Biden is losing the write-in here in New Hampshire. You can't say anything more pathetic than that.
So obviously he wasn't losing and he didn't lose at all. He won by a pretty impressive margin when you consider, again, it was an unsanctioned Democratic primary and it was a write-in campaign. There was no, it wasn't like checking something off. People had to physically write President Biden's name and he still won by a decisive margin. But to be fair to Marjorie Taylor Greene, it is sometimes hard to tell what numbers are when you're really, really drunk, which she seemed to be. But you know who is a really good source of political commentary? Jessica Tarlov. She's always reliable for it. And I love seeing her on the Five. She has the toughest job in mainstream media because she's up against 4 MAGA losers who constantly heckle and interrupt and gish gallop. And she's like Optimus Prime in the Transformers. I'll take you all on. And she's fending them all off. It's really impressive. She exposes the vulnerabilities of Trump's victory in New Hampshire. Because again, we're in the Republican primary, right? That's all well and good. He may have that down, on lock, right? But there's also the general election, right? He still has to beat the Democratic candidate, presumably President Biden. And in these next couple of clips, she points out serious vulnerabilities to Trump's campaign.
The independents were who decided the election in 2020. And then two really big numbers that matter that have jumped from Iowa. 43% of her supporters in Iowa said, I won't vote for him in the general election. That went up to 70% in New Hampshire. And then the question in the exit polls about what happens if Donald Trump is convicted of a felony, right? He has these 91 counts out there. In Iowa, 32% said that they wouldn't support him. And that number jumped to 50%.
All right.
You cannot win a general election with those kinds of numbers. And that's the case that Nikki Haley's making and why these Republican donors will continue to pump money into an alternative, because there are Republicans who are extremely dissatisfied.
As well they should be. Donald Trump was a terrible president. Now, as I mentioned, Jessica Tarlov does make an interesting point, as others have made, that the polling consistently suggests that if Donald Trump is convicted of any of his 91 crimes, that would shift the sentiments of a considerable portion of Republican voters, not a majority by any stretch, but certainly a statistically significant portion, which would doom him in a general election. Now, it's always interesting to me because most Republicans believe that the Department of Justice has been weaponized against Donald Trump and Republicans. They're wrong, but that's the prevailing belief. So why would a conviction from, weaponized courts make the difference? I don't know, but I suppose I shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth. I suppose I should be grateful that there's at least some subset of Republicans who still have some confidence in the court systems, that a conviction matters to them. But I digress. In this next clip, Jessica Tarlov goes into deeper detail about Trump's vulnerabilities while also somewhat defending President Biden as well.
I would tell him to be out there as much as possible, quite frankly. And we hear a lot about the lack of enthusiasm. Joe Biden, it's the first write-in campaign in history. What happened in New Hampshire? He's on track to get more votes than Barack Obama did in 2012. You talk about Dean Phillips, he got 20%, sure, but let's talk about the unity. There's only 10% of Democratic voters, self-reporting this, that would not supportE Biden. We are completely unified.
But that's the number you expect from an incumbent, right? I mean, that's a normal incumbent number.
But we've been talking about Donald Trump as a quasi-incumbent, at least. He has a record to run on, right? He's acting like he's an incumbent. He actually thinks that he won in 2020, so he's like half an incumbent. And 50%. He gets 50,000 votes, and 70% of his competitors' voters won't even go for him. But I hear about this basement campaign all the time from 2020 and even from now. We don't see Joe Biden, and it's shocking that we get all this footage somehow. But he is out there, and he's doing meaningful things. He was with the United Auto Workers today, getting their endorsement,
which I covered in a previous video as well. And she goes on to mention some of the recent public appearances that President Biden has made, which hasn't captured quite nearly as many headlines as you might expect. But he's not in the basement. And by the way, he won. So even if he is in the basement, who cares as long as he wins? Now, Jessica Tarlov is not the only person to know these vulnerabilities of Trump. Another person is the Republican governor of New Hampshire, the state in which that primary was held, Christen Nuno, who has endorsed Nikki Haley and has been a surrogate for Haley. This is what he had to say to CNN in the aftermath of Haley's defeat in New Hampshire.
Republican Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, who is supporting Trump, he tweeted, quote, "The Republican Party without Donald Trump is a disaster, morally and politically. It's endless wars, open borders, and tax cuts for the people who benefit from endless wars and open borders. Basically, it's Nikki Haley's platform, which is why we so desperately need to beat her," unquote. Your response?
With Donald Trump at the head of the party, we lose. We lost in 2020. We should have had the red wave in 22. He's a loser. His candidates are losers. I'm tired of losing. He doesn't bring the right brand, if you will, to the table, and he doesn't galvanize the party or the country together. So I appreciate J.D. Vance is hoping to get a job and another job in Washington, D.C., because he joined the Senate, realizes they don't do much, wants another job with the president. But at the end of the day, all these guys that are kowtowing up to the president, I've talked to them all behind the scenes. They don't respect this guy. They're just kowtowing up to him out of fear and the hopes to get something, another gig.
Now, listen, that's hilarious for a number of reasons. I like that energy from Christen Nuno. I like the fact that he's like torching Trump publicly, as well as the Republican sycophants who are endorsing him now. I will point out that Christen Nuno has said that if so everything you said there was true. But he's also said, even within the past 48 hours, that if Donald Trump becomes the Republican nominee, he's still going to back Trump over the Democrats. So it's the whiplash is insane. Oh, Donald he's a loser. He's terrible. He's morally inferior. He's an idiot. Nobody respects him. He's terrible for the country, blah, blah, blah. Oh, it's just him or a Democrat? Oh, well, Trump all the way. So pathetic. But I at least love to hear the words and the conviction seemingly with which they're delivered. The last thing I'll say is this. Dan Pfeiffer, a former Obama administration official, I think he was one of his speech writers. He's on Pod Save America. He has a great newsletter called The Message Box. And this is an excerpt from it, which I think, again, to just really drive home the fact that, yeah, Donald Trump won the Republican primary in New Hampshire. Again, I suppose it's fair for him to take a victory lap, but there are serious vulnerabilities I just really want to emphasize here. So according to Pfeiffer, Trump won the state by a decent margin. However, among the swing voters who will decide the general election, Trump showed potentially debilitating weakness. According to exit polls, Trump lost independent/undeclared voters by 30 points. What makes this number especially troubling for Trump is that the universe of independents who voted last night is a Republican-leaning slice of New Hampshire independents. Trump also lost moderate voters by a stunning 53 points and voters with a college degree by 15 points. Additionally, 40% of New Hampshire Republican primary voters said they'd be dissatisfied with a Trump nomination. So friends, listen, I know that the news surrounding the President Biden's polling is generally bad. I will also point out again, there are plenty of good and positive polls which get a fraction of the attention, right? Because negativity and sensationalism sell. President Biden is competitive against Donald Trump. And again, the campaign season for Biden really hasn't started until now. He's sitting on $117 million going into 2024, a war chest which vastly outstrips Donald Trump's, just blows it out of the water. President Biden has to play his cards right. He has to be on his game. His campaign, his staff, they all have to be firing on all cylinders. They have to be strategic and relentless and ruthless and take nothing for granted. But I want to just convey this. It is not certain that Donald Trump will win the general election. He could easily lose it based on his personality, based on his record, and based on the fact that he scares the hell out of voters. They despise him. They fear him. They think he's an idiot. So right now, we have to encourage people in any possible way we can to remember that the Democratic choice is the better choice for the country, including for conservative voters and red states. Donald Trump is a dead end for the United States of America. And the polling and performance show that he is going into this general election very vulnerable. Let me know what you think in the comments.